Thank you.
There are, of course, these big questions facing the government right now. In Cabinet, there will inevitably be voices pulling in different directions, even subtly. So who ultimately makes those big decisions at a time like this? Joining us now, Catherine Haddon, who studies the workings of Number 10 for the Institute of Government, and Will Walden, who worked at Boris Johnson's side for many years and saw many of his appointments being made. And Catherine, it was interesting to hear there is a resistance to even asking these questions amongst very senior Conservatives now, who just want to talk in terms of collective cabinet responsibility and see everything as done very much in that one tight core team.
Well, and that's quite understandable, really. I mean, they're trying to present the continuity of governments, assure the public that, with the Prime Minister in intensive care, which is a shocking moment for many people, for everyone in this country, that there is that continuity in government, that there is that strength and support. And that is the purpose of cabinet government. So they're right to emphasise why we have it, why it can work really well. But they're talking very much about the ideal. And I think what a lot of journalists are talking about is they know from talking to politicians it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you do need the Prime Minister to grip the system. And it's not just about those decisions that happen in cabinet, subcommittees. It's also about following up on all of that. It's about directing the whole machine and trying to make sure that those decisions are then followed through. And that's where you often end up with a strong character trying to do so. If that's not Dominic Raab, it could end up being other figures in the cabinet who have to try and make that. We've got other, very senior ministers who are running big parts of the coronavirus response. So there will be other people who are trying to do that. The problem is if they're pulling in different directions.
Yeah, it was interesting. Gito Harry, maybe I'll put this to you, Will, if I can bring you in here. Gito Harry was talking to me last night and he said, that the difference is that Boris Johnson won with this very big majority, very much on the back of the figure that he is. He's a very good messenger, or messenger, rather. Will it be difficult to fill that gap behind him of just getting the message out, selling what you're doing publicly?
Yeah, I think inevitably it probably will, Emily, but that doesn't mean that it isn't possible. And I think the important thing, we need to not jump ahead of ourselves. We all hope the Prime Minister gets better and gets better quickly and is back in charge in short order. But there was a reason that he appointed Dominic Raab above Michael Gove or Priti Patel or other cabinet ministers. And I was in the room when he made that decision. And that's that he implicitly trusts Dominic. Now, he may not be well known outside of Westminster or outside of appearing on Newsnight or political programmes, but actually he's a details man, and I think he's a quiet man, but I think he carries a certain level of authority, but he also, most importantly, carries the Prime Minister's blessing, and that's really important. Now, Catherine is right. In the long term, government can only function if it has a strong and powerful arbiter, and Boris Johnson, with an 80-seat majority, is without doubt, as Prime Minister, that powerful arbiter. And Dominic doesn't come with that because he's not the acting Prime Minister. He's not the Deputy Prime Minister. He is the First Secretary of State, essentially covering for the Prime Minister. But I think we need to be careful not to get ahead of ourselves. In the short term, he will have the blessing and support of talented cabinet colleagues who are foursquare behind him to do the best possible job in the short term for the country. He also has a fantastic civil service, fantastic support from the likes of Sir Mark Sedwill, the Cabinet Secretary, and Martin Reynolds, the Prime Minister's principal private secretary. And I think in the short term, he will be absolutely fine. The bigger question would be if, and I hope that doesn't happen, and I don't think it will, Boris is somehow incapacitated for a longer period of time. Do any of the things that your other guests have mentioned, Catherine's mentioned, come into play? I suspect that they won't because we're in the middle of a national crisis, but it is, of course, possible.
So let me put that point to you, Catherine, then. If it isn't as short term as we're hoping, if it is longer term, what shifts then in terms of how governments are run?
It's difficult to tell. I think that at this point that they will pull together in the short term. They'll know that the eyes of, the country, certainly, if not the world, will be on them, trying to make sure that they are working as a collective. And they'll be very conscious that, this moment is going to be looked at in history, for a long period of time. So no minister's going to want to undermine the government at this stage. They're going to want to work as a team. But longer term, there's key things about Dominic Raab's role that pose question marks. One is the fact that he's going to continue operating from the Foreign Office. There's probably very good reasons for that. His support network is all of there. Also, it could look as if he was trying to step into the Prime Minister's shoes if he moved into number 10. But that means that there is no boss in number 10. So there's a question about how that organisation actually works, who grips it, who makes sure that advisors, officials who work there also know what their jobs are, what they're trying to do. So there's lots of sort of question marks if this lasted for a longer period of time.
Will, very briefly to you, because I know you're a good friend, you've been at the PM side many years. Have you been in contact with him in the past week or so? How was he taking his diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, look, he's a busy man, and as a former advisor, I often get in the way and offer advice, which is, probably welcome occasionally and not welcome most of the time. But last week I had a brief exchange with him, and typical of him, he was in isolation, but he was more concerned about the fact that my wife, who used to work for him, has had a new baby in the middle of all this, and he was anxious to find out how she was and how the baby was. And I said to him, look, I'm worried about how you are, and he just said, look, we're going to beat this thing. And what he meant by that was not he's going to beat this thing. Indeed, I don't think he ever suspected that he would, this evening be in intensive care. It was about the spirit that he engenders as Prime Minister. It was about, we are coming together as a country, and I'm damned if I'm going to let this defeat this country. And so I was encouraged by that spirit. And look, he's a fighter. He's a strong guy. He's physically and mentally, a fit guy. I think he's fitter than he looks to many people. He'll run rings around you on a tennis court. And I think fundamentally he's well placed to recover from this in short order. And I think he'll be absolutely fine.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Will, and thank you to you, Catherine.